Hello, family. Welcome to the Black of the Berry. This episode, I'm going to do a special nod to Juneteenth. This is something that I think is very important to our history. So today we'll talk about a history that means everything to millions of Black Americans, and yet it remains misunderstood by many others. Juneteenth is a day of celebration, a day of remembrance, a day of grief, a day of triumph. That day, of course, many thought would never come and didn't know it had come. Now, it's for many people, Juneteenth is simply about a day of slavery ending, but the deeper truth is far more powerful, right? Juneteenth tells a story of freedom that was delayed, tells a story of people who had already been declared free, but they were remained enslaved. It tells the story of a government that issued emancipation but failed to enforce it. It's a story of Black people who celebrated freedom while still facing violence, discrimination, and oppression. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that freedom on paper and freedom in reality are not always the same thing. So tonight, again, we're exploring what Juneteenth is, why it matters, why it became a federal holiday, and why Americans should understand its significance. So if you're asking, what is Juneteenth? Now, of course, Juneteenth combines the words June and 19th, commemorated in June 19th, 1865, the day that Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston and announced that enslaved African Americans were free. It came through General Order Number 3. Part of that order declared that all slaves are free. Simple words, powerful words, life-changing words. But there was a problem. The enslaved people hearing those words should have been free much earlier, more than 2 years earlier. The Emancipation Proclamation and the truth that most people never learn. Many Americans are taught that slavery ended when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. So we're talking about June 19th, 1865, more than 2 years later. So again, when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, yes, slaves were freed, and that's partially true. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate states were free, but the proclamation could only be enforced where Union troops had control. So in areas that were still controlled by the Confederacy, enslavers often ignored it completely. Imagine that you have this order saying that all slaves are freed, yet uh, you have those enslavers or the masters that ignored that. Sounds like a lot of the history that we have going on today, where we have a whitewashing, if you will, deletion, just whatever with our history. And it's sad that I never even knew what Juneteenth was. I actually had a friend of mine, a Jewish friend of mine, that when he asked me about Juneteenth, it's about 4 or 5 years back, he asked me if I was going to go to work that day. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to work. He was like, you don't celebrate Juneteenth? And I'm like, what is Juneteenth? And that's, unfortunately, that's my truth. And I stand in that. But again, it's never too late to learn. Now, speaking of, Texas became one of the last strongholds of slavery as we're talking about this. So we're talking about the enslavers, and many of those slave owners actually moved the slaves into Texas because they believed Union forces wouldn't reach them there. So imagine that. You've been declared free in a Confederate state, and you have your enslavers that moved you into Texas deliberately, knowing that the Emancipation Proclamation had declared the slaves were free. So again, with that, imagine hearing that freedom had been declared, and you're waiting, and you're waiting, and you're waiting, and then you find out years later that you should have been freed all along. That's the story behind Juneteenth. Yes, about freedom delayed. And again, think about the emotions that must have existed on June 19th, 1865. Joy. I know I would have been joyful. There was shock. How could this be? The disbelief, the relief, and even the anger. And then imagine discovering that your labor had been stolen for years after that freedom had already been declared. Imagine learning that families have been separated, children were sold, lives were controlled long after the emancipation should have occurred. This is why Juneteenth carries so much emotional weight. It represents both liberation and injustice. It's a reminder that freedom delayed is its own form of oppression. And for many Black families, Juneteenth became Independence Day, not because July 4th has no meaning, but imagine July 4th is commemorating a nation that hasn't always been kind to us as Black people. So that's celebrating the birth of the nation that was not kind to those of us that were enslaved, our ancestors, and even created systems that oppressed those of us at the reach as far it's far reaching from then to now, and we're still fighting. And again, this is not because July 4th didn't have meaning, but it's because the promises of July 4th didn't initially include enslaved Africans and our descendants, or in the descendants rather. The Declaration, excuse me, I cannot talk. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal. Excuse me, all men are created equal, yet millions remained enslaved. So Juneteenth became a celebration of finally being included in the promise of freedom. Black communities would gather for prayer services, family reunions, barbecues, music, education, storytelling, community celebrations. This is where a lot of our get-togethers come from. Our history is so rich, and it's rooted in our upbringings, the things that taught us resilience, how to bounce back, how to continue to adapt, how to pivot, how to survive. These celebrations preserved history when schools often ignore them. It preserves truth when others try to erase it. It preserves dignity in a society that frequently denied it. And one of the biggest misconceptions is that freedom solved everything. When truth be told, and we know that to be the case today, freedom didn't solve everything. After emancipation came, there were black codes, sharecropping, convict leasing, segregation, Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, lynching. And although legal slavery ended, a lot of these things are still occurring today. The oppression evolved. Juneteenth, therefore, reminds us that freedom is not a destination. It's a continuous struggle. Every generation must protect it. Every generation must expand it. Every generation must fight for it. Every generation. That's part of why I'm doing this podcast, because I want to shed light to my generation of the things that I didn't know, because I can't be the only one. And then the generations that come after, the story has to be told. The legacy has to continue to live. And who's going to make sure that it still lives? It will be us. And for generations, Black Americans celebrated Juneteenth largely without national recognition. Communities passed the traditions down to themselves. Parents taught the children. Churches preserved the history. Neighborhoods held annual celebrations. But the broader nation often paid little to no attention. That finally changed in 2021. Juneteenth, National Independence Day Act, was signed into law by Joe Biden. Juneteenth became the first new federal holiday created since Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The recognition represented more than a day off work. It represented acknowledgement, recognition of a history that had too often been minimized or ignored. Some critics asked, why do we need another holiday? Other people argued that focusing on slavery divides Americans. And there are those of us that say that not focusing on slavery not only divides America, but it's destroying America. Understanding history is not division. Ignoring history is. No nation becomes stronger by forgetting. Germany teaches about the Holocaust. America teaches about Pearl Harbor and September 11th. Likewise, understanding slavery and emancipation helps America understand itself. Juneteenth isn't about guilt. Juneteenth is not about guilt. It is about truth. And truth is the foundation of healing. And of course, today, Juneteenth stands as a reminder that progress is possible. It reminds us that oppressed people can survive. It reminds us that justice may be delayed, but people will continue fighting for it. It reminds us that our ancestors, I just lost my place. And of course, you guys, this teleprompter, I do not like teleprompters. But anyways, hang on just a second, because I completely lost my place. Hang on just a second. Technology can be a friend or it can be an enemy. And in this case, it's my enemy. Let's get back to where we were. Please hold as we experience technical difficulties. All right, where are we? All right, Germany teaches about the Holocaust. America teaches about Pearl Harbor and September 11th. Likewise, understanding slavery and emancipation helps. Juneteenth is not about guilt. It is about truth. Truth is the foundation of healing. Again, Juneteenth stands as a reminder that progress is possible. It reminds us that oppressed people can survive. It reminds us that justice may be delayed. Here we go again. Yeah, I hate this teleprompter. Absolutely hate this teleprompter. Here we go. Hang on just a second. Thank y'all for being patient with me. I cannot believe this teleprompter is doing this. All right, so here we go. Understanding slavery and emancipation helps America understand itself. Juneteenth is not about guilt, it's about truth. And truth is the foundation of healing. Today, Juneteenth is the reminder that progress is possible. It reminds us that oppressed people can survive. It reminds us that justice may be delayed, but people will continue to fight for it. It's their ancestors endured unimaginable hardships and still found reasons to celebrate. Black Americans, we didn't wait for permission to honor freedom. We created our own traditions. We preserved our own history. We carried the story forward until the nation finally got it. That resilience is worth celebrating. Juneteenth is not about the end of slavery. It's about the value of freedom, about resilience and truth. It's about a people who survived chains, auctions, family separation, discrimination, and exclusion, and still found a reason to celebrate. For Black Americans, Juneteenth is a declaration that our story matters, our ancestors matter, freedom matters, and that history matters. Because when we know where we've been, we better understand where we're going. Now, again, this is about a day that represents freedom, justice, and delayed promises, as we already said. This day represents the resilience of Black people in America. Now, for many Americans, Juneteenth, again, is simply just another holiday. But for us, it's more than that. It's a day that our ancestors had to learn that freedom was finally theirs, that it's a reminder that freedom delayed, again, it's not denied. Now, there's pain in the truths that we haven't acknowledged and openly talk about. There's pain in the triumph, but there's also victory and joy in the triumph. We talk about the resistance and the lessons that come along with Juneteenth. Because again, it's not just Black history, it is American history. And if we don't understand Juneteenth, and we don't fully understand America, and if we go all the way back to 1776, the U.S. declared independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence, again, says that all men are created equal. And the last time that I checked, Black men, Black women were included in that. Now, there's a contradiction. Millions of Africans were enslaved. And there's a modern day slavery system that again has evolved. It still holds many of us. America's been fighting for its own freedom while denying freedom for others. The same nation that protested taxation without representation, it allowed human beings to be bought and sold. This contradiction became the original sin of America. For nearly 50 years, enslaved Africans built wealth for others. We cultivated tobacco, harvested cotton, built roads, built ports, built fortunes. They helped build the economic foundation of this nation while remaining legally considered property. Creating wealth for a nation that legally considered them to be property. But despite slavery, Black people would never stop resisting. We have never stopped resisting. Some of us escaped, some revolted, some sabotaged plantations, some preserved culture and identity. The desire for freedom never died. Juneteenth is a part of that larger story. Many people are thinking today that, again, slavery was simply about hatred, and this is why a lot of us don't want to talk about it, because it's just about hatred, and nothing could be further from the truth. Hatred was certainly involved, but slavery was also about money, enormous money. Cotton became one of the world's most valuable commodities. Enslaved land generated immense wealth that still, up until this day, a lot of us, the wealth gap exists because, yeah, we made the money, but we're not deserving to have any of the money. Let us not start talking about reparations. Banks profited, insurance companies profited, plantation owners profited, shipping companies profited. Entire economies depended on slavery. And when slavery became profitable, system created to justify it. Ideas about racial superiority were used to defend economic exploitation. This is why understanding Juneteenth requires understanding economics. Freedom threatened wealth. And whenever freedom threatens wealth, resistance follows. And this is one of the most important parts of the story as to why it took 2.5 years. So again, the Emancipation Proclamation, it became effective on January 1st, 1863, and Juneteenth didn't occur until June 19th, 1865. So you ask yourself, why was there a delay? Now, the excuse and the justification by some was that communication was slow. And that may be partly true, but many historians also point out another reality. Slaveholders had powerful incentives to withhold information. Every additional day of forced labor meant additional profit. Every additional harvest generated income. Imagine discovering you should have been free for over 2 years. Imagine realizing that somebody had knowingly continued to exploit you for your labor. That's why Juneteenth, again, is simply not a celebration. It's not just a celebration. It's about a reminder of injustice, that freedom was announced, but it was not immediately delivered. Now, there's an emotional reality behind that day. So let's go back into, let's imagine that day all over again. Families are gathered, words spread rapidly, people cried, people prayed, people shouted, people sang, and some probably laughed, and others likely stood in silence trying to process the news. Now imagine spending your entire life enslaved and suddenly hearing you're free. What would freedom even mean? Could you leave? Could you find family? Could you own land? But let's talk about finding family. Imagine the grief that ensued because I want to go look for my family. Many of those family members are lost forever, never to be found again, yet alive. But what about the ones who died, never to be found again, or never to be embraced again, never to be told I love you again? But again, could you own land? Could you vote? Could you learn to read? Could you finally determine your own future? For many newly free people, freedom was both exciting and terrifying. They had gained liberty, but they had also inherited uncertainty. And why Juneteenth has become sacred in the Black communities, this is the part that often gets overlooked. Black Americans protected Juneteenth long before the federal government recognized it. Year after year, generation after generations, families gathered, churches organized to celebrate. Communities bought land specifically to hold Juneteenth events. Children learned the stories, food was shared, music filled the air, history was passed down. These celebrations became acts of resistance. And when schools ignored Black history, Juneteenth taught it. When society minimized Black contributions, Juneteenth honored them. When people tried to erase the past, Juneteenth preserved it. Juneteenth survived because ordinary people refused to let the story die. So again, the freedom after slavery, the misconception that slavery ended and equality began immediately, there's nothing again further than the truth. After slavery, we talked about the sharecropping, we talked about Jim Crow, we talked about segregation and voter oppression, convict leasing, red line, employment discrimination, things that we are still feeling today. The change changed form, but many barriers remained and remain. This is why Juneteenth resonates today. It reminds us that legal freedom and actual freedom are not always the same thing. Legal freedom and actual freedom are not the same thing. You can be legally free and still face obstacles. You can be legally equal and still encounter discrimination. Now, these last two lines, you can be legally free and still face obstacles. You can be legally equal and still encounter discrimination. The struggle for freedom did not end in 1865. It evolved. And some people ask, why should everyone celebrate Juneteenth? Nobody said everyone should celebrate Juneteenth. Everyone should have an understanding of Juneteenth. What you choose to do with it, that's on you. But as for Black people, we should celebrate Juneteenth. Freedom belongs to everyone. Juneteenth tells us what happens when freedom is delayed. It teaches us the importance of justice. It reminds us that democracy works best when everybody is included. It challenges us to ask the difficult questions. Who still lacks opportunity? Who still faces barriers? How do we create a society where liberty is more than words? Juneteenth invites all Americans into that conversation. And in the recent times, Black people have constantly been allies with other demographics. Our civil rights are not just our civil rights. Civil rights are civil rights for all people. Asians, Latinos, everybody, the people that don't often return the consideration to us. But we're not going to talk about that. So again, imagine if our ancestors were alive today, what would they say? What would they say? They'd imagine if the ancestors who first celebrated Juneteenth could see America today. They would see Black doctors, Black judges, Black CEOs, Black mayors, Black entrepreneurs, Black educators, Black artists, Black elected officials. But would they be proud? Would they be disappointed? In the midst of all of this, there would be some emotions that I would like to be a part of, just to be in on the conversation. Yes, they'd see progress that they could barely imagine, but they'd probably also remind us to not take freedom for granted, that we should protect it, use it wisely, and expand it for future generations, and never forget the sacrifice that is possible. And I don't know why, when I just read that, I'm thinking about Thurgood Marshall and what he would think and feel if he would be able to sit and have a conversation with Clarence Thomas today. But we're going to leave that alone. So before we leave tonight, I want you to think about something. Juneteenth is not simply a celebration of the day that slavery ended. It's a celebration of a people who never gave up hope. It's about people who survived the unimaginable, people who kept singing, kept praying, kept believing, and kept fighting. And eventually, they saw freedom arrive. This lesson of Juneteenth is not that justice always comes quickly. The lesson is that people must continue demanding it. For Black Americans, Juneteenth is memory, it's resilience, it is survival, it is joy, it is pain, it is victory. And it's also proof that even when freedom is delayed, the human spirit continues to reach for it. And again, this is why we celebrate it, and this is why we remember. Because remember, the blacker the berry, the deeper the truth. We'll see you guys back here next week, same time. This was a special episode here on Thursday night. So I just wanted to say happy Juneteenth to everybody, but especially to my Black friends and Black relatives and Black brothers and sisters. Happy Juneteenth. We got our freedom.